Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Getting through a federal security clearance investigation has always been a little harrowing. The process is also often the reason it takes so long to get federal workers hired. But recently, some say the process itself has become political, and that poses a danger to national security. Virginia Democratic Senator Mark Warner has recently introduced legislation with Senator Susan Collins of Maine to address this issue. Senator Warner joins me now to explain his concerns and his bill. Senator Warner, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Terry, for having me on.
Well, we're going to talk, first of all, about a joint piece of legislation that you and Senator Collins have recently introduced, the Integrity and Security Clearance Determinations Act. Can you tell us a little bit about that legislation and why now?
Well, actually, this is not the first time that Republican Senator Susan Collins and I have put this in. It goes actually back to the first Trump administration when there was concern that the Trump administration would try to politicize security clearances. We saw them taking away security clearances from folks in the Obama administration, former leaders in the intel community like John Brennan, the CIA director. And then we even saw them, at least the one thing you'd have to say about the Trump team is they are equal opportunity abusers, where they took away the security clearances of, for example, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and took away any of his security detail. And, one of the things that we should have learned over the years is that our country is kept safe by having an intelligence community that's willing to speak truth to power and not, in a sense, corrupt the process or try to bend to whatever the administration wants. And for your listeners, you only need to, for those who remember, mention the Iraq War and how we got into that when it appeared that intelligence had been cooked. The reason why this is so important now is in the second Trump administrations, President Trump's willingness to politicize activities is exponentially higher. I've been very disappointed with the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who we've seen in the news recently in the Washington Post about trying to create a kind of master source of all information, which raises both civil liberties concerns and also this notion that she's going to check people to make sure whether they are loyal to the administration. Earlier this year, she literally fired a couple of senior intelligence individuals because they wouldn't change their intelligence product. They've been doing an investigation into this Tren de Agua, very bad gang in Venezuela. These are bad guys, but they wanted to have a report that said they were controlled by the Maduro government, and they basically couldn't. That was not what they found. So they wouldn't change the product, and they got fired. So this legislation says that the security clearance process should not be politicized. People should be able to get their security clearance if they are no threat to America's national security. And on the other hand, once they get that clearance, there has to be a valid reason for someone to have that clearance taken away. It can't simply be because, whomever happens to be the current administration, and we're seeing this in spades with the Trump administration, starts to try to politicize this process. It's kind of a common sense piece of legislation, and any other time, I'm not sure we would even need it. But we need it now, and I'm going to see if we can get it into the Intel authorization bill. It is interesting that a number of my Republican colleagues who were always quick to point out when there were any kind of leaks or activity that came under Obama or Biden, and even under the first Trump administration, they were more on it. Under this Trump administration, are very concerned about ever getting crosswise with this president.
So, sir, what are the provisions in the bill itself that would help prevent the politicization as you've described it?
Well, what you would have to do is if someone were to try to have your clearances removed, you'd have to show cause. You'd have to show, that they are in jeopardy of releasing sources and methods. We would put a more objective criteria on the front end. Matter of fact, we'll ensure that security clearance process is the words we use in the legislation: fair, objective, transparent, and based on published criteria. There are many times, and this is not just the politicization issue, but there are many people that never get any answer why their security clearance didn't come through. So we wanted to try to put a little more transparency there. If you don't get it, you ought to be told why. Now, again, that's a little problematic as well. This is not as easy as it sounds at face value, because if someone gives somebody that was vetting you and they pointed out something that was a problem, that person may want to give that information on a confidential basis. You've got to weigh it's not as simple as it sounds. So there needs to be that balancing. But at the politicization level, where you're simply getting your clearances removed because whoever's the current administration doesn't like your politics or doesn't like your views, that is the antithesis of everything the intelligence community is supposed to be about.
I'm speaking with Virginia Democratic Senator Mark Warner. Sir, I want to change topics just a little bit. You represent a state that has a significant number of federal employees and government contractors. What's your initial take on the recent Supreme Court decision that lifted the injunction on the Trump administration's proposed agency restructuring and reductions?
Very disappointed. This effort, and again, it was all what's more remarkable is I guess we should have been forewarned, and to my federal workforce who voted for, if any even voted for President Trump, they should have been forewarned. I mean, the person who wrote the Project 2025 book, which is clearly the game plan, is now the director of OMB. And his goal, he states, was to traumatize federal workers so they felt bad about coming into their jobs and would quit. We then went through the initial stages of DOGE, where people were getting fired willy-nilly with no plan. And, I think the ignorance of some of those kids on the DOGE effort, the DOGE bros, who didn't realize it may be one thing to fire a coder at Twitter because there's other coders, but you can't fire an air traffic controller or a meat inspector or a CIA agent without having ramifications. So when they did start these mass firings, an injunction was made to say, hold on here. And I was disappointed, to say the least, that the court said, well, even though they are not weighing in on the merits of the case, in the interim, the Trump administration can go ahead and do these dislocations. I think it's puts more fear across the workforce. It adds more trauma. And frankly, what this also is doing that scares the dickens out of me is that who in their right mind is going to want to go work for the federal government if any kind of contractual obligation or anything you have could all be, not taken away by Congress, but an arbitrary president. I often like to think, we've worked really hard on trying to increase, for example, in Virginia, some of our veterans' health care facilities. We've got a brand new one down outside of Fredericksburg in Spotsylvania County, another one down near Virginia Beach in Chesapeake. It took 10 years to build the facilities, and again, an example where we need to have more efficiency. But they're only about a third staff because who's going to go work for the VA when the VA secretary says they want to cut 30,000 jobs? So I was very disappointed by this court. It feels to me they have a very expanded view of the rights of a president to kind of override Congress. And if that continues, we're not going to have what we all had come to expect from the kind of traditional balance of power between Congress, the executive, and the judiciary.
Well, sir, what do you see as the sense of Congress about these reorganizations? Is Congress going to take back its authority to direct and control some of these actions?
Well, Terry, you would hope so. I mean, it's what I hear privately from my Republican friends is different than what I hear publicly. I may have mentioned already, on the national security domain, people are terrified about what they're doing in terms of politicization. But so far, getting people to move past private conversations to voting that way has been a challenge. And then on the federal workforce, in many ways, the real challenge, rubber hits the road, will be next week when a bill that's already passed the House, the so-called rescissions, where the Trump administration is going against what Congress appropriated. And this is in terms of things like foreign aid and also things like NPR and Corporation for Public Broadcasting. If the president can just arbitrarily take that money back, if my Republican friends don't stand up for that, then I don't know when they'll stand up for taking back, Article 1 legislative power. And these are the kind of, I fear, mistakes that not only traumatize our workforce and put our folks not willing to do federal service, but once you kind of get rid of these norms, the genie's out of the bottle, and you can't then say, okay, it's all safe to come back. This, in so many areas, this administration is rushing to make decisions that in many ways, even if they're reversed, they're still going to be damage done.
Do you think there's a final straw that might break the camel's back on these issues?
Well, Terry, I got to stay optimistic, or this job becomes a lot tougher than it already is. But there have been a half dozen times already I thought we were, so close on getting people to to stand up. Now, at the end of the day, in Virginia, we're having elections this year, and that will be viewed as a report card on the Trump administration. And I know this is not a political broadcast, but people, I think, can send a message. And then, in 2026, whether you're a federal worker or whether you're one of the 17 million Americans that will lose their health care because of this god awful bill, or whether the 8 or 9 million Americans are going to lose any kind of food support, people need to remember who brought you these actions. I think there were probably a lot of federal workers that thought, well, Trump won't really do this stuff. I'd like to see lower prices, and I'd like to see a more secure border. And I think you can be for a secure border without being for grabbing people off the street when they pick up their kids at school or go pay a parking ticket at the courthouse. But we're sure as heck not seeing lower prices, and this kind of total disruption of a federal government that in certain areas needed reform. But this is not reform. This is just chaos for the sake of chaos.
It's Virginia Democratic Senator Mark Warner. Sir, I know you have a very busy schedule. Thanks for joining me.
Terry, thank you so much, and I'm glad you're continuing this great tradition at Federal News Network.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.